The flame within, struggle and hope. Arizona, a land where the sky touches the cliffs, where the heat never leaves even at night, and the wind carries with it the smell of sage, snakeskin, and ancient songs. Here, among the canyons, as if carved by the knife of time, lived the Apaches, children of sun and stone. Their footprints sank in the sand, their words in the fire of their campfires. When the sun was at its zenith, a young man named Chato walked alone on the trail of trials. His face was covered in ash, his body naked to the waist, his father's knife in his hand. His father had fallen a year ago from the bullet of a blue uniform. Chato hadn't smiled since. Even the wind seemed to have bypassed him. He would climb the sacred rock where the spirits lived. There the shaman was waiting for him, as old as the desert itself. His skin was like bark, and his eyes like coals in ash. The shaman sprinkled Chato's forehead with the blood of a coyote and said,
You will become a warrior, but know that your war will be different. Your arrow will not always seek the enemy's breast. There will be love in your life, a love stronger than a spear, the kind that can burn a tribe or save it, a love like war.
Chato said nothing, but something inside him trembled, as if a rock had cracked with thunder. At night he sat by the fire alone. The wind whistled through the rocks. He stared into the flames where the shadows of his ancestors danced and wondered what his father would say. And in the sky above him rose a red sun, not the usual one, dim and heavy, as if a harbinger of something great and terrible. Thus began his song, the song of the rocks, where every heartbeat sounded like a drum in battle, where love could be the last arrow or the only salvation. Getting to know the heroine. Elizabeth Riley came to Arizona from the east, a place where smoke from fireplaces hovered over rooftops in the mornings and churches sang in the evenings. Her hands were used to holding Bibles and bandages, her eyes to reading letters under a kerosene lamp. She had grown up among brick and rain, but there was always something inexplicable in her, as if her soul was calling her onward to where the earth still breathed its primordial breath. She came in a caravan with missionaries and medicine men, driven by the dream of her father, a pastor whose faith was as strong as his wrinkled palms. He wanted to build a school, a hospital, and a small chapel on the border with Indian lands. Elizabeth, on the other hand, wanted to understand the meaning behind the words savages and unbridled. Her heart knew no hatred, just curiosity, compassion, and the quiet courage that lurks in the chest of women who can walk through fear. The first time she had seen the Apaches was not from afar, but close by, when a wounded boy was brought into the camp. He was barely alive, shot in the thigh, his face covered in dust. The men recoiled. "Savage!" someone hissed, but Elizabeth leaned over him and began dressing the wound. Her hands did not tremble. Her voice was quiet but firm. She didn't ask permission. She just did what she thought was right. And then he appeared. Chato. Among the wounded man's escorts, he was the most silent. Tall, with skin the color of scorched earth, with facial features as if carved from rock. He kept his eyes on her, not out of distrust, not out of anger, but as if because of something he could not understand. His gaze wasn't like the others. He wasn't just looking at her. He was looking into her. And Elizabeth, for the first time in a long time, felt something pounding in her chest that she hadn't expected. He stood in the shadows, and she stood in the sun. Between them, a wounded child and the whole world. She looked up and met his gaze. Time froze like amber, and then he turned away. She couldn't sleep for a long time that night. The wind beat against the tent canopy. Who was he? Why did his eyes, full of pain, seem familiar to her? She sensed that this was not just an encounter. It was the beginning of something dangerous, inappropriate, and yet inevitable. And in the mountains, under a starry sky, Chato sat on a rock, staring at the light of a distant camp. He didn't know her name, but he knew her voice, knew her touch when she had saved that boy. He knew there was no fear in her hands, and that worried him more than the white man's guns, because he understood fear. But kindness he didn't. The next day she went to him as he was watering his horse. She asked if the boy needed willow bark for his fever. He nodded, briefly, without looking. But as he left, he glanced over his shoulder. From that moment on, their paths crossed more and more often. He was silent. She spoke. He listened. She smiled. There was a chasm between them. Culture, memory, pain. But they could both feel it already. It was beginning to narrow. No one knew yet what would come of it. But there was already a tension in the air, somewhere between her words and his silence, like before a thunderstorm, or something beautiful. Culture conflict. Each day the desert grew hotter and the people grew sharper. The winds brought not coolness, but dust and gossip. Some said the missionaries wanted to convert the Apaches to slavery. Others said the Indians were slaughtering cattle and stealing women. The truth was lost somewhere, like water in the sand. Chato was a warrior. He grew up with the idea that whites were a threat, that every fort was like an ulcer on the body of the land. He had seen caravans pass through sacred sites, soldiers trampling ancient paths where warriors used to pray. He didn't need to talk. He had eyes and scars. He was learning to hate in silence. But Elizabeth spoke. She opened a tarp tent in the camp and hung a sign over the entrance that said, "Knowledge heals like grass." She taught the children, not just English, but respect for the languages of their ancestors. She gave medicine to whites and Indians alike, and so she was a stranger to all. White women whispered, "What is she doing with the savages?" Husbands shunned her. Even the pastor, her father, was sometimes silent, looking at his daughter with concern. But she went her way, like a river through rocks. Chato came to her school one day, just to watch. In the shade of a tent sat 5 Indian boys. Some held a quill, some held a twig, some just stared. Elizabeth showed them drawings of the sun and the words next to it. Sun, Sunday, she. She said the word in their language. The children laughed. He saw. They were not afraid of her. Then she came out. She saw him. She was embarrassed, and she didn't leave.
"You don't agree with what I'm doing."
She said. He didn't answer.
"But you came. That means you want to understand."
He said quietly.
You teach them words, and words are like stones. They can build, and they can hurt.
She smiled.
"Then let's build. Together."
From then on, they began to talk, not as friends, not as enemies, like those who felt they had to speak because the silence had become too heavy. She talked about the ocean, about trains, about snow. He talked about spirits, about trails, about a mountain you can't look at noon. They sat by campfires, under trees, by rocks. They talked of blood and stars, of death and birth. Sometimes he laughed, softly, as if remembering he could do it. She asked him once.
"Why do you always look north when you're silent?"
He replied.
My father died there. I'm looking for answers.
"And do you?"
Sometimes. Sometimes you say them.
But everything around him was shrinking. The tribal elders whispered, "Chato goes away too often." Soldiers in the camp said, "He's watching us." Whites and reds alike distrusted what they didn't understand. Elizabeth could feel it. The looks, the whispers, the aloofness of her father. And still she went to him, and he came to her. It was as if the desert itself, silent and eternal, was pushing them toward each other. But they knew it could not last forever. One day, at sunset, they stood on the top of a hill. The plain lay before them, and the wind fluttered their hair and feathers as if it knew. This moment would be important.
"What do you want?"
She asked. He was silent for a long time. Then he said,
That my people would live, so that I don't have to take up arms anymore, so that the land sings, not screams.
She nodded.
"I want the same thing. But maybe for it to sing, it needs someone to teach it to listen first."
They looked at the earth, both on different sides of the story, but no longer enemies. Not yet. Tragedy and the ignition of feelings. The day started quietly. Too quiet, as hunters say before the storm. The morning mist lay on the slopes like the breath of the dead, and the birds did not sing. In the Apache village, the children played by the creek, the women dried corn, the old men smoked pipes. Even Chato, who had returned from hunting, allowed himself to relax for a moment. He watched his mother, aging but proud, sing over the frying pan, the song of rain that her father had called for. The world was as fragile as the bark of an egg. And then shots rang out. Rangers came from the west, wearing dusty cloaks and eyes blind with fear. They carried a map that marked, bandits, rebels were hiding here, and no one cared that it was a mistake. A machine gun burst rattled over the rocks. The first to fall were the dogs, then an old man, then the women. Chato rushed to the center of the village, but it was too late. There was screaming, blood, disorder everywhere. He found his mother at the entrance to the wigwam. She was clutching her stomach. The life was already draining out of her. Her eyes were open but staring through him. He held her to his chest, screaming, calling, but she only whispered,
"Take care of the song. Don't let it die."
and she died like a branch in a fire, silently, suddenly. That was the day Chato's faith died, in people, in conversation, in restraint. All he wanted was revenge, and he would have gone at it like a storm if a voice hadn't appeared to break the silence.
Chato.
Elizabeth. She came on horseback with a basket of medicine, bandages, herbs, and fear in her heart. She didn't know what was going to happen here. She just heard the gunfire and went. He saw her and couldn't believe it. Thought it was a trap. Yelled at her to leave. Called her daughter of the killers. She wouldn't leave.
Where are the kids?
She asked. Her voice shook, but her hands were steady.
Go away,
He hissed.
Where are the children, Chato? Where are the wounded?
He wanted to turn away. He wanted to turn to stone again. But then he saw her go to the fallen teepee and pull the boy out from under it. His leg was almost torn off. Elizabeth starts dressing him in the mud. She works silently, quickly. Then another with burns. Then a woman with a broken face. He watched. He couldn't understand why. And then something inside him broke. Not the rage. It was still there. But underneath it, like ash, was the pain he'd been silent about for too long. And it broke through. He fell to his knees and covered his face with his hands. He cried, for the first time since his father had been killed, and it was as if the ground beneath him had gotten softer. Elizabeth came over, sat down beside him, didn't speak, just put her arms around him. And that gesture, silent, warm, impossible, was stronger than all words. Not like medicine, but like a fire that doesn't burn, but warms. That night they stayed in the village. People looked at her with apprehension, but no one touched her. Chato said, "She saved ours." And that was enough. They sat by the dying fire. He held her hand. She looked at his fingers, strong, scarred, but now trembling, and she said,
I don't want war, Chato. I want you to live.
He looked at her, and for the first time, he didn't see a woman from another world. He saw a human being, a light, salvation.
Then stay close, while you can.
And she stayed. Love in spite of. The forest was their hiding place, not the dark, damp forest of the north, but a rare Arizona forest, with tall pines and soft needles underfoot, with birds that called by name and a wind that didn't carry gossip. Here they could be neither enemies nor strangers, neither heroes nor sinners. Here they were simply Chato and Elizabeth. He would come first and wait in the shadows like a hunter. She would follow, quietly, with a book or a bundle of fresh wormwood. They spoke little. Words were not the main thing here. Silence spoke here. One day he led her to a spring hidden among the rocks. The water there was as cold and clear as the first snow. He handed her an amulet, carved from a coyote's tooth, hanging from a rawhide strap.
This is for you,
He said,
The coyote is not only a trickster, He's also a survivor. He lives where others cannot.
Elizabeth took the amulet, put it to her heart. Then she slowly rose up on her toes and touched his lips. The wind stopped at that moment. Even the birds fell silent, and the world was kind for the first time in years. Their love was not simple. It was like a snake, slithering, hiding, but ancient. Like an eagle, high and dangerous. Like rain, rare, but changing everything. He taught her to hear the forest, showed her where foxes prowl, where owls sleep. She taught him to read. The first words were peace, earth, believe. He looked at the letters as strange footprints, but gradually he began to recognize their paths. Sometimes he would take her fingers to trace the lines, and every time they said goodbye, he put his hand on the back of her head as if to protect her from the wind. But neither forest nor tenderness could hide them forever. The Apaches were recognized first. The tribal elder, with a face like dried earth, called out to Chato, said,
"You have forgotten your father's dust. You have forgotten your mother's blood."
Chato replied.
I remember, but I don't want my son to remember only death one day.
The old man looked at him for a long time. Then he said,
"Then you are not one of us."
Then the white men found out. Someone saw her following the trail, carrying fruits and herbs in a basket. Somebody told the officers. Rumors spread in the camp that she was sleeping with the chief. She's a spy. She's a traitor. Even her father wouldn't look her in the eye. Once, in the evening, he said,
"Do you know they killed your mother?"
She replied.
Do you know who we killed?
He turned away. He never spoke to her again. Now their meetings became even quieter. Each time they said goodbye longer, held each other tighter, talked less. They realized that everything could be over. Each step could be their last. But still they walked on. One day, in the rain, they stood under an overhanging rock. His fingers were on her face, her lips on his neck. Water ran down the rocks like tears of earth. He said,
We are not made for this world.
She replied.
Then maybe we are made for each other.
And at that moment, time disappeared. Only the two remained, under a rock, amidst rain and breath. At night, in her tent, she wrote in her diary,
I don't know what awaits us, but I know that this is the present. And even if everything burns tomorrow, I am grateful for this day, for his hands, for his eyes, for the fact that I'm alive.
And somewhere in the desert, under the stars, he gazed into the fire. And he thought, love is not something that comes easily. It's something you fight for. Torture, betrayal, and salvation. The shadows grew longer, and with them came evil that could not be hidden behind words or prayers. There was silence in the camp, but behind it lurked a storm of guile, suspicion, and hatred. Elizabeth knew that their love was like a flame in the wind. It could be blown out, but it could also be rekindled. One morning, as the first rays of sunlight faintly broke through the fog, soldiers appeared on the doorstep of her tent. Their faces were stony and their eyes ruthless. Without explanation, they arrested Elizabeth, charging her with espionage, saying she was passing white secrets to the Apaches. Her father tried to pray, but his words sounded hollow. When Chato heard about it, it was like a thunderclap. He could not believe that their love was the cause of her torment. Without a second thought, he surrendered to the authorities to free her, knowing that in these hands he was just a prisoner. He was captured, bound, beaten. His body was covered in bruises, and his soul was on fire. In the dungeon, where the walls were colder than winter, he saw Elizabeth sitting, weakened but with a burning gaze. Their eyes met, and in that instant there was no fear or pain between them. There was promise. But salvation did not come immediately. During a sandstorm, when the wind whistled like 1,000 voices of the dead, Chato's allies from the tribe infiltrated the fort. Darkness and sand hid their footsteps. They found weaknesses, guards, doors, windows, and wrenched Chato free. He carried Elizabeth in his arms, barely on his feet, through a storm that seemed like a living thing that wanted to destroy them. With each step, it seemed as if the earth shook with them. When the storm subsided, they were far from the fort, in the shadow of the ancient cliffs. His body ached, but he was smiling. Her eyes glistened with tears.
We are free.
He said in a whisper.
Thanks to you.
She replied. But the war in the hearts of the people did not stop. The tribe and the whites rejected their alliance as sacrilege. They were threatened with banishment, even death. But they knew that to love, you had to be willing to fight. The battle for love. The tribe stood around the fire, faces as hard and cold as the stones that shook in the wind. The elders cried out that Chato had betrayed his people, that love with a white woman was a disgrace and the wrath of the spirits. It seemed to them that he had chosen death by denying his tribe. There was no mercy in the white man's camp either. The officers whispered behind their backs, looking at Elizabeth incredulously. Her father, a pastor, refused to see his daughter as one who dared to break the laws. She stood before him, tears and pride in her eyes. Chato knew there was no choice. The tribe demanded renunciation. The whites demanded exile. He could have succumbed, dissolved into stillness, forgotten all that was. But he chose love. On a night when the stars were especially bright, he gathered his wits. Elizabeth was waiting for him by the river, where the water gently touched the banks. He handed her the last amulet, a sign of promise and strength.
I am leaving the war,
He said.
but not from you.
They sailed down the Rio Grande amid the light of the moon and the whisper of the wind. A glance back at the tribe that stood silently on the shore, at the faces full of pain and understanding. One old warrior, covered in scars, nodded. It was forgiveness without words. In the boat, surrounded by silence and the lights of the night, they were the beginning of a new story. A story where love is stronger than prejudice and war, where two souls found each other in the middle of the vast desert, the path of two elements. Years later, the desert that once seemed lifeless and harsh became their home, a home of love, patience, and memory. In a small hut of clay and branches lived they, Chato and Elizabeth, and their son. The boy, whose skin wore his father's warm hue and whose eyes glistened like his mother's, was a living symbol of their union. Elizabeth often told him a tale, the tale of the eagle and the woman of the wind. The eagle who soared high above the cliffs, and the woman whose breath could lift the winds. Together they created storms and clear days. They were elements learning to be in harmony. Chato listened, sitting close, feeling Elizabeth's words warm their little hearth. He knew they were like fire and water, different, but together able to create the vapor that moves the earth. And as the sun set over the horizon, coloring the sky in shades of red and gold, their home would be filled with quiet laughter and the breath of the wind, an eternal reminder that love is not just a feeling. It is a force that can overcome all obstacles. This story is not only about love and struggle, but also about unity, overcoming borders and respect for culture and nature. It is based on the belief that even the most different hearts can find common ground if they hear each other. May this story inspire you with understanding and compassion, and remind you that true strength is in love, not war. Thank you for joining us on this journey through time and space, through the dust of the roads and the eternity of the desert. May the red sun over the heart shine on you always. If you enjoyed this story, support us with a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Your feedback is our strength and inspiration.